This podcast contains potentially sensitive topics. Listener discretion is advised.
All I want is a room somewhere far away from the cold night air, with one enormous chair. Oh, wouldn't it be lovely? Oh, wouldn't it be lovely? Lovely, lovely, lovely. Oh, wouldn't it be lovely? I would always sing that to amuse myself, because I didn't know if people, when I was busking, if they knew that I actually would really love a room somewhere.
I'm Rex Holbein, and welcome to You Know Me Now, a podcast conversation that strives to amplify the unheard voices in our community, as well as the individuals and organizations that are in service to those in need. In these episodes, I want to remind all of our listeners that the folks who share here do so with a great deal of courage and vulnerability. They share a common hope that by giving all of us this window into their world, they're opening an increased level of awareness, understanding, and perhaps most importantly, a connection within our own community. Today we have the great pleasure of hearing from Sabra Boyd. For those of you who don't know Sabra, she is the editor-in-chief of Real Change, Seattle's award-winning street newspaper. Sabra herself is also an award-winning independent journalist, public speaker, consultant, and web developer. She covers stories about exploitation in all forms, including healthcare, homelessness, trafficking, tech, prison, food, and beauty. As usual, we start the conversation asking Sabra to tell us a bit about her childhood.
I was born in Arizona. I was born on the set of Raising Arizona, the Coen Brothers movie. And I worked as a child actor. My first job as a child actor was when I was 6 months old, ironically, to advertise a college savings account for a bank, like a college savings program. And then, of course, there was no college savings account for me because my parents stole all the money I earned as a child actor. My mom worked on the set of the movie, and she was working in the film industry until we had to run away from my dad, because he had destroyed her career by basically calling every single director, producer, agent that she worked with who would hire her and threatened to kill them. And so it is a small industry, or a tight-knit industry, and so nobody would hire my mom. And so therefore, we just didn't have any money at that point. And he would also steal her paychecks when she did manage to get a job.
Sabra was a talented kid with plenty of smarts, but she was also born into an unstable and very abusive family.
I decided to run away when I was 7. I had this plan, as a 7-year-old's plan, and I had a horse at the time because I also competed in rodeos. I was a rodeo princess. And then I packed my saddlebags with apples, sandwiches, water, a lot of water because it was the desert, and then my headshots and my resume as a 7-year-old, because my plan was to ride my horse to California from Phoenix to LA. I was going to book a job within a week because I wasn't like a super famous child actor, but I was a working actor, and I'd get a job within a week on a commercial or something, and I'd get a place in Malibu, and my brother and sister could come live with me. This was my plan. Yeah, I was going to be a 7-year-old head of households, and
yeah, with a 3 and a 2-year-old helping out.
And if my mom and I were getting along at the time, I might invite her. So I set off riding west, and I knew the direction because that's where the sun set, and so my horse and I were riding, and then we hit our first highway. And I'd never tried to ride my horse on a highway or across a highway, and so the first giant semi-truck that roared past he reared up and just pivoted and ran the other direction, just galloping. And I held on tight and thought I was going to fall off, thought I was going to die. I managed to hold on, and I just kept telling him, it's okay, please slow down, and pulling on the reins.
Turn around.
Yeah, and I managed not to fall off because, after all, I was a rodeo princess and and a barrel racer, and I didn't fall off. And then I was like, we have to try again. So I turned him back around, and I could just feel his body tensing as we got closer and closer to the freeway again, And then the minute that he set his hoof on the pavement, he reared up and galloped the other direction again. When I finally got him to slow down again, I was just like, well, I can't go back home because he was just so violent. And I mean, as a kid, I honestly did think it was normal. But I still didn't want to go back to it because, as a kid, the family that you grow up in is kind of like the first culture, the first subculture that you grow up in. So you think that that's normal. Yeah. And I thought that when other kids went on vacation, they were also like being forced to stay with men in hotels for a week at a time. Like when they would say, oh, I went to Disneyland, I'd be like, oh, I did too. And then I just assumed that also meant that their dads had left them alone in a hotel room with men. I thought that's what going to Disneyland meant for everyone. Worldwide, data shows that most child trafficking victims, their first trafficker is a family member. It fits the same statistics and profiles as child molestation. Usually the first abuser is your own parent or family member or family friend who has groomed the entire family. Children are vulnerable in a unique way because, you're hardwired to trust your caregivers, to trust your parents or whatever adults are, tasked with and appointed to care for you.
They are your protectors.
Yeah, and so if they tell you, like, this is the way things are, this is normal, you are hardwired biologically to trust that. And then compounding that is the fact that children do not have legal rights of their own. You, as a kid, even, a 17-year-old, you only have as many legal rights as the adults around you are willing to bestow and protect for you. And so if you're surrounded by abusive, exploitative adults, you essentially don't have legal rights. And then in addition to that, just kids in general, like, especially as an editor who wants to amplify and platform youth voices and perspectives on issues, a frustration that I hear from young writers as young as like 8 years old or middle school or high schoolers, they all share with me, like, when I tell a politician something, when I write to the state legislature or write to the mayor or the governor or our congressional representatives, they don't take me seriously. They're condescending the majority of the time because I am not a constituent who's old enough to vote.
Sabra's father tightly controlled the household. He was physically and mentally abusing his wife and the children. They were in a constant state of fear of him and the ties he had to the mob. When Sabra was 10, her mother fled with the children. For a good deal of that time, the family was homeless, on the run, and hiding out from Sabra's father.
When I was 10 is when we finally ran away from my dad as a family, like my mom and my brother and sister and I. And we were homeless all over the West Coast, in California, in Utah. Living in the Virgin River Valley in Utah was just so magical. In the mornings when the sunrise would creep down into the canyon, you could see the mountain goats perched on these rocks against the sunrise. And then when we lived in the Redwoods, like Humboldt County, I loved it there so much. It was like living in a cathedral.
Did you as a child understand homelessness as the issue that it is, or as a family unit without your dad, was your mom making it work so that it was not, I think maybe the word I'm looking for is traumatic. It was actually okay. Is that a fair? It was
better than the fear of not knowing when my dad was going to come home, and he was always really physically violent whenever he would get home, and he was a construction contractor, so he would be gone for months and then would randomly show up and just be incredibly violent. So to answer your question, it was a relief to be away from him, but we were essentially on the run from him. So we had to keep moving so that he wouldn't find us and try to kill us as he had threatened. And my mom did make the best of it. I mean, she had her moments as a good parent. Like, she really wanted us all to have our own rooms, but we were homeless, and so the tent we had these canvas separations. So we each had our own quote unquote room, but it was just a piece of canvas in between.
Corner.
Yeah. I mean, and I could hear my brother snoring next to me, but there was a canvas piece making in my own room, But so she had kind of a sense of, she would try to create kind of a sense of magic to it.
While on the run, Sabra's mother eventually brought the family to Port Angeles, Washington. Why did she come to Port Angeles?
My grandfather retired there and had a stroke soon after. And so we went there ostensibly to help take care of my grandfather. And then shortly after that, my mom kicked me out for being gay. My brother, I don't blame him for this at all, because he was, just a kid, and all of his friends had teased him at school and told him that I was gay. So he ran home and announced, he thought he was like the person with the big news. And, as a journalist, I totally get that. Like, I want, hear ye, my sister's gay.
Read all about it.
Yeah. But, so I don't blame him at all, but he ran into the house and announced that I was gay, and my mom flipped out. And I think at the time she was struggling with addiction. She would sometimes not come out of her room for a week, and so I would be the one caring for my brother and sister, cooking, making sure that they got to school on time. And so, that got her to come out of her room, though, and she kicked me out and said she didn't want me or my bad influence in her house or around her children. Calling my siblings her children was like, well, I'm the one who parents them, but okay, whatever you say. But anyway, she was just screaming at me, and I was worried that the neighbors were watching, and I was embarrassed, and so I just left. And I didn't want to be late to school the next day. Ever the nerd and rule follower, I didn't want to be late to class. So I went back to school and slept on the roof of the high school theater, kind of like a feral teenage gargoyle. And then in the morning the bell would ring, and that was my alarm clock essentially. And I just had to be really careful climbing down, and because I didn't want the cheerleaders to see me, because the rest of the soccer team, because they would have bullied me even more. And that worked for a while. And then it started to get too cold, and so I moved into a hippie commune, and I lived in the goat stable of the hippie commune.
Were you still going to school?
I was, yeah. And I was also working several jobs. I was working as a landscaper. I was also working on a couple of farms. I was also working as a barista.
Sabra continued with her schooling and tried to fit in at the hippie commune as best as she could.
There were a few hippies who would ask the older hippies, newcomers to the commune, is she a narc? She doesn't want to do drugs. I offered her mescaline, and she said no. I offered her this dank organic weed, and she said no, thank you. What is wrong with her?
Right.
And the older hippies would say, no, she's not a narc. She's just boring. And the truth was that I had an intimate, up close and personal experience with my mom's addictions, and I was just too afraid to drink or even use, cannabis or anything. And so I just didn't do any of that. So they were really, some of them were really suspicious of me for a while.
Sabra was just 14, alone in the world, living in a commune. While it had been difficult to fit in, there was a couple who showed her kindness and looked after her. One evening, they propositioned her for sex. She left the commune and was once again homeless. Not having a place to go, she remembered a small cave she had discovered while hiking near the Elwha River.
That's the point at which I moved into a cave. above the Elwha River. And this was before the dam was removed. So there was like, you could walk across the dam to the other side. And I don't even know if it exists now, since it probably doesn't, since the dam has been removed. But there was this kind of ledge on the cliffside and this shallow cave. So it wasn't like a deep lair or anything. It was just like this shallow cave that kept me out of the wind and the rain. And it was still cold, but I had my sleeping bag and a bivy sack, and it was really nice. I had this fantasy of going to college. I just had this really romantic notion of like Oxford or Cambridge, or I also really wanted to go to the University of Chicago because the campus is so pretty. So yeah, there were like all of these schools that I wanted to go to. And so I was trying to figure out how to make that happen, how to pay for that. And I was going to the library and researching scholarships and stuff. And I found what I thought was the perfect scholarship. Like, it was for a lot of money, and it was for the Ayn Rand Institute. And I didn't know who Ayn Rand was. I had never heard of her or read her work. But the instructions on the scholarship were read every Ayn Rand book and write an essay about your truest calling in life. And I had a typewriter in my cave. It was like this robin's egg blue typewriter. And I read every Ayn Rand book in like a month, and I sat down to my typewriter. Dear Ayn Rand Institute, my truest calling in life is altruism. Yeah, I did not get the scholarship. I know now that, homeless teenage girls living in caves are not the target demographic of the Ayn Rand Institute scholarships. So yeah, I didn't get that.
Sabra was struggling. She was living in the woods with no plans on how to move forward, questioning her future. One morning, she had an encounter with a deer.
I woke up to this deer, like, kind of snorting and eating grass near me. And I just woke up and was looking at this deer. And I just remember, like, maybe this is a very autistic coded thing of me to say, but I remember thinking, like, I don't want to be a human. Pretty much all the humans I've known up to that point are just awful and cruel. And I wish I could be a deer or some other animal. And I remember thinking, I was born in this body as a human, and so I need to just embrace that. And then I also just started thinking about, well, I could live in the woods forever. Like, I was good at foraging, I was good at like building shelter and like surviving out there. But I started to think, well, if I do this for the rest of my life and I live like hidden in like the whole rainforest or something forever, by the time I'm, 40, 50, 60 years old, like if I break my ankle, like that, I'm not going to have access to Advil or whatever.
Practicality.
Yeah. And so I just started to kind of play out what that would look like if I was, just feral in the woods for the rest of my life. And I realized like that doesn't sound so nice once I'm older and not able to get around as easily and forage and everything as easily. So I was like, well, I was born in this human body, so I'm going to try to embrace that, and I'm going to try to join society and, assimilate into society again. Society just felt so foreign to me. And also, with the parents that I had, I was like, well, if society was my parent, what would society say? I'll probably go to college. And so I was like, okay, well, so anyway, that's kind of what spurred me to just kind of have a goal beyond just living in the woods and like go to college. And eventually I ended up in Seattle.
At 17 years old, Sabra made her way to Seattle.
When I first got to Seattle, I remember, I think it was the Westlake, transit tunnel. And I had not encountered an escalator in years. I don't think there are any escalators in Port Angeles, or maybe there are now, but I was so terrified of the escalator. Like I just was such a I mean, I keep saying the word feral, but yeah. So I braved...
You were a raccoon at the bottom of the staircase.
Yeah, exactly.
These moving stairs,
yes.
wondering what's going on.
Yeah. So I eventually braved the the escalator, and I slept in... I just needed to be somewhere dry and warm-ish. So I was sleeping in the Westlake transit tunnel, and this guy came up to me and tapped my shoulder while I was sleeping, and he pointed at like a cop that was walking toward us, and he said, you're about to be arrested, like you should come with me so you don't get arrested or anything for sleeping in here. And so I hopped up and followed him, and then the cop didn't follow us, and we went out of the transit tunnel, and he asked if I'd eaten, and I hadn't eaten in like a few days. And so he took me to the McDonald's on Pine, and he bought me a Happy Meal, and and it was back when they still had the indoor dining, which they don't have anymore. And he was actually a Real Change vendor, and so that is kind of part of how how it's such a great full circle moment to be in this position as the interim editor-in-chief.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
He was a Real Change vendor. I can hardly believe it's like in those moments you think, God, the universe is working its magic.
Yeah,
right?
and I wish that I knew his name. I don't remember his name. I vaguely remember what he looked like. I know he was staying at the Mission.
Sabra remained homeless in Seattle for a while. She slept outside near where the Real Change office is located and spent the majority of her days in bookstores and libraries. The university libraries allowed her to blend in as a student, a privilege being the age that she was. Through hard work and lots of help from others, Sabra managed to get into and graduate from Portland State University. Throughout that time, she worked in hospital administration. Along the way, she got married and then divorced due to the domestic violence of her wife. Escaping that relationship, she once again became homeless in Seattle. However, things were about to turn around for Sabra. She started working as a freelance investigative journalist and food writer. Her articles were published in major national newspapers, such as the New York Times and the Washington Post, and the magazine Savoir. She edited a few books, lived in Taiwan, Paris, and London, and all of that journey led her to take advantage of an opportunity at Real Change to be an interim editor-in-chief. I'm thrilled to report that between our recording sessions over the last several weeks, Sabra is no longer the interim editor-in-chief, but actually the official editor-in-chief at Real Change. I asked Sabra to tell me more about Real Change.
Yeah, so Real Change is Seattle's premier street paper. We are a member of the International Network of Street Papers, and we still use a business model from 100 years ago with street vendors selling the paper. We are an independent nonprofit news outlet, and then the other side of what we do is providing very low barrier jobs to mostly to people who are unhoused or unstably housed or formerly, experiencing homelessness. And, because a lot of times if you're currently homeless for whatever reason, it can be very difficult to get a job. And we just have like one of the lowest barrier options. It also allows people to basically be an entrepreneur and hone their sales skills. A lot of vendors, once they do get a job, they still sell the paper as, additional income.
And low barrier, for people that might not know what that means, what it, in a sense, is that somebody that wants a job can walk into Real Change and get a job.
Exactly.
And the things that would keep them from getting a job are, or is it super low barrier where there's, go ahead.
No, it's so many things. I mean, sometimes the barrier to getting a job when you're homeless is that you are exhausted because it's not safe to sleep at night. And so you just have this, constant struggle with insomnia because it's literally unsafe to sleep at night when you're living outside. Selling the papers at Real Change might be an option, might be a better option because you can build your own schedule. You just have to come pick up the papers when the vendor center is open, but otherwise you you get to decide your own schedule. Other barriers could be that you maybe have a criminal record, and as we know in this country, our legal system, is very racist, and many people have criminal records that should not have them. But a simple background check that a prospective employer might do isn't going to dig into, well, were you fairly charged? Was your case fairly represented? Was the judge racist? That sort of thing.
It's just going to bounce you.
Yeah, they're just gonna move on to the next candidate, and so, that's another example of low barrier.
Yeah. Bottom line is, somebody that's homeless in the city of Seattle and wants a job can come to Real Change.
Yeah.
And pretty darn sure can get a job.
Yeah.
Tell us about your job. What do you do? What do you typically write about? I'm guessing most people know what an editor does, but tell us what you do. And then you're a writer. What do you focus on typically at Real Change?
Yeah, that's a good question. Every day is a little bit different. It's a weekly paper, so the schedule for getting the paper out the door on Wednesdays, because we print Wednesday morning. So Mondays and Tuesdays are our busiest day. Those are the days when we are finalizing drafts, we're fact-checking, we are getting the proofs ready for the copy editors. We have an amazing team of copy editors who are all volunteers, and we are so grateful for them every week. Yeah, so we get the proofs to the copy editors on Monday. Tuesday, we finalize everything and send it to the printers by Tuesday evening, and then the paper's printed on Wednesday. Wednesday through Friday, I spend in meetings, doing interviews and reporting and editing, and it's so many things. And then in addition to that, it's really important to me, like as someone with lived experience of homelessness in Seattle, it's so important to me that the newsroom is not separated from the vendors and from the unhoused community. So a lot of my time is also spent chatting with vendors, doing writing workshops with them and other people in the community. It's really important to me to amplify the voices of people who are usually not listened to. There are few phrases that I detest more than give voice to the voiceless. No one has ever been voiceless, I would say. I mean, even if you don't have the ability to speak, you're not voiceless. I see my job very much as amplifying people who very much already have their voice, but helping to build that platform and amplify that. And
so when you write for Real Change, tell me what you write about and what motivates you.
Yeah, well, I like to say that my beat as a journalist is exploitation in all its forms, whether that's our carceral system and prison labor, or human trafficking, or financial abuse and identity theft, exploitation of natural resources in our food supply chain, just exploitation in all its forms, just as I've always really gravitated toward that. But I also, especially with everything that's happening in the world right now, I don't want it all to be, depressing news. There is some good news, believe it or not, in the world these days still.
I'd like you to give us your definition of exploitation, because I think we all in general know what that is, but I want to hear it from you, what that means to you.
Yeah, well, as a survivor with lived experience of human trafficking, child trafficking, both sex and labor trafficking, and also homelessness, I really define exploitation as preying upon vulnerability. There are always going to be people who are opportunistic for whatever reason, whether that's just because they're wired that way to be awful for whatever reason, or out of desperation themselves, because there are some traffickers who end up doing that out of economic desperation themselves. I always say that human trafficking is, a crime that centers on preying upon vulnerability. And that vulnerability can look like so many different things. It can, look like domestic violence and just your sense of autonomy and worth being eroded down to the point that psychologically you what would normally be a red flag that you would say no to, you just don't have the wherewithal to assess that or say no. or, and homelessness is one of the biggest risk factors for trafficking victims because, what you would normally say no to if you're stably housed, stably employed, you don't have just a bunch of violent crises happening all the time. The things you would normally say no to, you're less likely to when you're homeless.
That line gets blurred.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
And you've written about exploitation not just in those kind of obvious homelessness, trafficking, but in other topics like food. And can you run through a little bit of some of the other areas that we wouldn't necessarily think about exploitation in?
Yeah, well, I think especially with what ICE is doing, and just I'm at a loss for words to, succinctly describe what's happening, but the predation on immigrant communities, the institutionalized predation that ICE is deploying and the federal government is deploying has, it's especially highlighted things like the H-1B visa. So in terms of agriculture and our food supply chain, the H-1B visa is a very easily exploited type of visa that a lot of agriculture workers have in the last decade, in recent years come into the U.S. To work with, but it's very easy to exploit that visa for a bunch of reasons I could go into. And then also regarding agriculture and our food supply chain, the 13th Amendment has a loophole, the 13th Amendment that was supposed to outlaw slavery in the U.S. It has a loophole in it that allows for prison labor to basically be the modern version of slave labor in our prison system. And because it says if you're convicted of a crime, if you are a criminal, you don't have the right to not be enslaved in the U.S., essentially. And there's been a lot of efforts, including, a great documentary by Ava DuVernay, I think it's called The 13th, about why we need to close that loophole in the 13th Amendment. My little sister, who is also a survivor of homelessness and trafficking and domestic violence, she was in prison, and so I just find, and she's one of many people who are trafficking victims who are then imprisoned for various reasons, oftentimes because they have defended themselves against their trafficker or another abuser. Then the irony of it is that when they're in prison, they are pushed into forced labor by our government.
In a sense, trafficked again, right? It just keeps rolling for them. Yeah,
but quote unquote legally trafficked by the government.
Yeah, I think I saw somewhere climate change, tech, healthcare. These are all places where in our society we see exploitation.
Yeah, so I can just kind of run down just with a couple of tangible examples. So with climate change, an example in the U.S. is the LA fires. There's been a lot of reports since the LA fires of people being homeless because they lost their jobs or they lost their home. Because they've become homeless, they are more desperate and willing to just kind of say yes to whatever's offered to them. Well, and people who have worked as personal chefs or gardeners for wealthy people in LA who lost their home, they then therefore lose their jobs because the landscaping job that they had is gone. It was burned up, literally. I know someone who was really desperate for a job and was offered a job nannying and ended up not being allowed to leave the house and was basically imprisoned under what was originally the auspices of a nannying job. One of the things that made her especially vulnerable was that she's a former foster youth. I know that you've interviewed people who are survivors of the foster care system, and it creates its own kind of trauma. And there's a lot more to her story, including that she was abused by someone who was a police officer, so she also she didn't feel safe going to the police for help because one of the reasons she was in that situation was because of police.
Listening to you talk, it's hard not to want to think why do we have this? Like, is it human nature? I mean, I know that's a big question, but it feels like in every situation you have someone that's going to be more vulnerable than another person. Mm-hmm. And so many times around the world, in all sectors, we have one human taking advantage of a more vulnerable one. Is it built into us? What's going on?
I want to be more optimistic than that. You
think it's systems
it definitely,
it?
Yeah, but I mean, we also build those systems that reinforce it, right? So it's like there's the individual, like one trafficker, one victim dynamic that can exist. And then there's also, like capitalism, and like can exploitation be eradicated in a system of capitalism?
Yeah,
I don't know.
Dog eat dog.
Well, yeah, because you
rules.
always have to have someone on the bottom. Yeah. There always has to be that market competition in capitalism. So, and people, like real people, have built those systems. But I think the cognitive dissonance is a lot easier for someone if they're a politician passing a bad policy, or a banker who's like building these systems that are going to create a hierarchy. But ultimately, I think it's about economic disparity. I mean, there's so much data that shows that we are living in a time right now of some of the worst economic disparity gaps ever. It's arguably worse than during Hoovervilles, and also with what's happening with ICE deporting so many people without due process. I don't want to be a fear-mongering whatever, but our food supply chain very much relies on migrant labor. Yeah. Anyway, we just have like a very extreme economic disparity model right now, and Seattle is a microcosm of that. I think that Seattle in the 90s was very different before the tech boom, and I mean you really see it now. Like, it's very difficult to have a comfortable life in this city if you make less than $100,000 a year. If you're working at a restaurant, like we talked a little bit about exploitation in the food industry, but in the restaurant industry specifically, most of the bussers and a lot of the front of house staff and line cooks and stuff that I've interviewed for stories, especially in South Lake Union, so they work in the restaurants where Amazon executives who make $500,000 a year or more, where they go eat lunch. And the busser, the dishwasher, the line cook, the server at the table, a lot of times they have to take public transit to South Lake Union from Renton. And that can be 2 hours both ways. That can be a 4-hour commute to make minimum wage. Another aspect of
it's not sustainable.
No, and another aspect of exploitation is there's also the loopholes where if someone is disabled and, for example, Goodwill, a lot has been written about like Goodwill hiring people for sub-minimum wage, and they can do that because maybe this person has a disability, and so because of our federal minimum wage laws, they're allowed to pay that person less than minimum wage.
I did not know that.
So there's exploitation all around us all the time, and it's not just one person. It's not just like one abusive person and a so-called victim. It's in the system. It's in the water. It's like describing water to a fish. We're swimming in it.
Tell us how your life has informed, for instance, writing about homelessness and trafficking, both of which you've experienced.
Yeah, I think that more than anything, it's given me a humility to know that I only have one perspective of homelessness, and trafficking, my own lived experience of it is one sliver of that. And so I try to bring a humility to it, that there are perspectives of it and experiences of trafficking and homelessness that I don't know personally, but I want to bring humility to the conversation. And something that I always say when I teach writing classes, especially journalism classes, is you don't want to know what the ending of the story is when you start out. Like, I mean, you can have an idea of where the story is going, but let it surprise you. Like, let it just see where it takes you, and have the humility and grace to flow with that. it's kind of similar to like the scientific method where you have a hypothesis, but you don't want to set out to prove your hypothesis right.
Let the science prove it.
Yeah, but I do think that there's a lot to be said for having lived experience and being able to understand intrinsically like how asking a certain question or phrasing it a certain way can be really triggering to someone, because I always am really cognizant of like, I know that I need to ask this person this question, whether it's for fact checking or something else, but I sometimes phrase it as, you don't have to answer this if you don't want to, but I wanted, I needed to ask this because of this, and phrasing it that way so that it's like more of a partnership in developing and learning the story. As a journalist, there have been so many articles, so many stories that I have pitched to editors, and I have literally been told, you can't write this because you're inherently biased. And they say that because they think that because I've experienced trafficking and I want to report on this story about a form of trafficking and exploitation that I didn't personally experience, but I have like sources and knowledge of the background that a journalist who's never experienced that wouldn't come in knowing. Like, I always argue, like, I have a nuanced perspective of this, and I'm very familiar with the background of the story and everything at play. And I've had so many editors at the New York Times, the Washington Post, I probably shouldn't name the other ones.
That's actually really shocking to me. It's like saying, I'm sorry, you're biased, your Harvard education is biasing you on this.
Oh, they never say that, though. They never say that.
But they're both forms of gaining knowledge and information, right? Well, it's really kind of surprising to me.
It's an antiquated definition of what objectivity is in journalism, or that being unbiased is the lens of, a cisgender heterosexual white man, and you also see this in other ways too. There have been trans reporters who have been told you can't report on trans stories because you're inherently biased, even if it's like a trans mask person reporting something about like something that happened to a trans femme person. And it's like saying, well, as a human, I can't report on stories about other humans. I need to let a robot do that, you know?
I think it's really interesting what you just shared about what is an unbiased human.
Exactly. We all bring ourselves to reporting, to storytelling. Whether you're a journalist or a poet or whatever, you bring yourself, and that's what makes it compelling. Like when I usually, not all the time, but I usually can tell when something's been written by AI and it just feels soulless because it's not bringing a human perspective to it and a humanity. And another example of this is during the Black Lives Matter protests, there were Black reporters. I think one of them was in Pennsylvania, one was in, I want to say Wisconsin. There are actually like documented instances of Black reporters being told you can't report on the BLM protests because you are Black. Right? Yeah. Just so listeners know, Rex has just this shocked, like disgusted look.
Well, I've never heard this before, so it's really interesting to hear that, and also it's baffling, right? Mm-hmm. Like it seems, it's like telling a fisherman you can't explain what fishing's about.
Right. Yeah, that's a great analogy. Yeah, and I will say that sometimes there are stories I'm reporting on where I have like personal lived experience that somehow coincides with it or intersects with it, and it does make reporting on it more triggering. But that's part of being human, and I have a good therapist and I work through it and it's okay. And yeah, everyone does have bias. Everyone is human. And so sometimes I do need to disclose that I might have a conflict of interest, or, this is like, I will sometimes at the top, like in the first paragraph, explain my own experience with a story or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I think as long as you disclose that.
Yeah. I think if you're doing your job, where you are producing journalism, right?
Yeah, with transparency and honesty. Yeah.
Where do you see the biggest pushback? Like what is the barrier when you're working to expose and educate and activate society around the issue of exploitation, where do you see the biggest pushback? Like, what is the hump to get over, in other words?
Yeah. Many of our systems that create an ecosystem where exploitation thrives, the very people in power who have created those circumstances and literally profit from them, also claim to want to be the philanthropist to solve the problem that they created in the first place. Is it Audre Lorde who said the quote about trying to dismantle the master's house with the master's tools?
Point is that it makes it doubly difficult when you're trying to address something that with somebody that actually created the problem or is part of the problem. Yeah.
And so I think that's the tension, because I was like, without naming names because I don't want to be sued, I was asked to be a keynote speaker at a tech company conference about human trafficking, and they asked me for an outline, and then originally they said they didn't want to draft my keynote, and then they changed their mind, and they censored it to the point that I had to stay up until 2 a.m. the night before, getting it to a place where they were still going to allow me on stage. And I didn't think I wasn't specifically saying anything about that tech company, but I was criticizing the tech industry for trying to solve the very problems in human trafficking that many of them have created in the first place. And just this kind of savior mentality. Without getting too much into this and turning this into a tech podcast, I'll just say that human exploitation is a very human problem, and I think we get kind of enchanted by the idea that everything can be solved with a new app or a new AI or something. And it's just a very human problem that might use more technologically advanced tools. But ultimately, we have to address those roots of vulnerability. What are the things that make people vulnerable? It's not whether or not they have an app. It's whether or not they have a place to sleep at night that's safe. Because there have been a lot of apps built to try to solve homelessness or human trafficking. And some of them are apps for referrals. But if you don't have housing to refer someone to, the app is a waste of money. You know, it's putting the cart before the horse.
Yeah, and I could also trip into this conversation, and I'll just keep it short by saying, I think the apps are a tool, but at the end of the day, they're a tool to facilitate relationships.
Yeah.
And if you don't have relationship, right, you don't have anything. I think, in fact, if you have housing but don't have relationship, you still don't have anything. You know, most of the people that move into housing that don't have relationships, even one, right, they end up often self-harming because of the loneliness and the disconnect, right? So we can't forget that solving these issues really are all built on relationship and connection.
I used to get in arguments online and in real life with people about Housing First, because, you know, Housing First is a proven model that works. And so many people will say, who don't understand it, will say, well, they need they need so much more. They need therapy, they need detox, they need whatever. And I'm like, when I say Housing First, I do mean wraparound care. I mean everything that you need to support that and more. If I use the word Housing First, I don't just mean throw someone into a studio apartment in a terrible building that's falling apart. Yeah, that's not what I mean at all.
Yeah, yep. Apps and tools are not enough. It's the human side of this journey that actually addresses ultimately each of the issues.
Yeah. Well, and one other thing I was going to say about Housing First is that, when I was a homeless teenager, one of the requirements for me to qualify for this one housing program was going to therapy, but I was still living outside at the time because the youth shelter was full. And, you know, as we've talked about, it's not safe to sleep at night oftentimes because, you know, it's dark and you're more likely to be attacked. And so I just had this constant insomnia and literally was unable to sleep because of safety. And so when I would go to these mandated therapy appointments to get housing, to qualify for housing, I would just fall asleep because it was the only place that was safe for me to sleep. And it was very therapeutic sleep, but it was like useless therapy. Like, so when people are like, oh, they need to basically prove that they're going to do well in an apartment that we give them or something by going to therapy or drug treatment meetings or, AA meetings or whatever the case may be. I'm like, it's useless if you're just going to sleep there because it's the only place that's safe enough for that.
Yeah. It does require, you use the word wraparound care, right? Like, if you have a bicycle and built up with many parts, but if one of the parts isn't working, the tire's flat or the derailleur's broken, right? It basically takes the bike out of commission. Right?
Yeah.
And so we do need to think about humans as holistic beings that need care on lots of levels.
Right. Yeah.
Housing and love and support and attention and food and clothing, all of those things.
Yeah, and it also reminds me of like when I moved into my first apartment after being homeless for years, because I was homeless for about half of my childhood. When I finally moved into my first apartment, I was so scared to like put anything on the wall and really like fully move in and live in my new home because I was just waiting for the next thing to drop. I was just waiting to be homeless again. And it took years and years to like feel stable, to feel like, oh, I can trust that this isn't going to be ripped out from under me.
Yeah, this is real.
Mm-hmm.
Earlier, I asked what were the barriers to addressing, exploitation. And you talked a little bit about sometimes the very people that are out there trying to do something good are actually involved in setting up what went wrong in the first place, right? Mm-hmm. But also, if you took 10 people just walking down the street in Seattle that don't have that kind of connection to the larger systemic issues, but are just good human beings, but still not involved, maybe only because of ignorance, not having experienced it in their life, not having been able to slip through and not be overly exploited. I want to ask, like, what is the message to them to, with regards to increasing awareness of exploitation and potentially moving that towards some sort of action?
That's a good question. I guess what I would ask is, I would ask everyone, consider what are the safety nets that you have in place between you and spending a night on the street. And some people have thousands of safety nets between the bed that they sleep in each night and sleeping on the street. And those safety nets are very tangible things like, oh, I have 12 family members who could all loan me at least $100. Yeah, count every single one of those family members. I would say that that's like the very first safety net to consider, because the majority of people experiencing homelessness, not everyone, but the majority don't have family that they could rely on, either because there's not generational wealth there for a variety of reasons, especially racism, or they just don't have family. Maybe they have a really cruel family who won't talk to them because they're gay, or maybe they have struggled with addiction and their family has just cut them off. I just really encourage everyone who's listening, like, count your safety nets. Yeah,
and count your safety nets to what end?
Mm-hmm.
To what end? Like, you're asking people to count their safety nets to increase their empathy and sympathy, not some empathy and understanding of people outside, or as a vehicle to getting involved to make a difference for those, maybe provide safety nets?
Yeah, both, I think. So in the U.S., it's being eroded even more so now, but we do not have a good social safety net system. We don't have, like, when you tell someone, we'll just stay in a shelter, like, most of those shelters are giant open rooms, oftentimes infested with bed bugs. You're sleeping next to someone who might be very violent. And even if you don't know whether they're violent, you're scared to sleep next to a stranger. And so yeah, count safety nets to understand, just for for empathy's sake, and to understand the path to homelessness is oftentimes just how many things are there catching you before you have to sleep on the street? Like how many walls are there between the bed you sleep in right now and sleeping on the sidewalk outside your home?
Yeah.
And then in terms of what to do, really tangible action items, there is nothing wrong with giving someone money on the street. I know that $20 to me, I would love to just spend $20 on like bubble tea. $20 is going to mean so much more to someone who's sleeping on the street tonight than to me who just wants to get bubble tea. That $20 is so much more valuable and going to mean so much more to them the way that they're going to spend it than the way I would spend it. $20 could mean the difference between whether or not they have their dose of insulin. If you give them $20, they can buy food that they know that they can eat. It gives them autonomy and dignity. It's also an investment because I can guarantee you, like, the majority of homeless people will pay that forward. The moment that they can do something generous for another person, they will. Not everybody, but I would say that the vast majority.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty well-known, documented fact that for whatever reason, people in poverty actually give a higher percentage of what they have to others. Take a moment to speak about altruism.
Oh, I do feel like it is like my truest calling. We're all connected, and that includes like generations before and after us. The world that we're living in today is because of greed and a lack of altruism. And when I say I mean like the worst parts of it, what's happening with ICE, what's happening with poverty and homelessness. That's such a good question. You've kind of stumped me.
Well, that's okay. I find it interesting that altruism would come up in a conversation about exploitation, right? It's almost like it starts to become the good versus bad or good versus evil. I also believe that we all have everything within us. Like, we do have good and we do have bad in us. And so we have our altruistic sides and we have our exploitive sides, right? I think it's life is in some way the management of those two forces within us.
Yeah.
And what brings one forward over the other. And you've talked about a little bit in this talk about economic reasons that can get people there. I think trauma. I mean, it's hard to understand exactly what brings that forward.
Yeah, and I think you can't talk about altruism without talking about selflessness and generosity. And at the same time, there have been many times when I have been too generous or too selfless, and especially in the way that our society in the U.S. especially is structured, you do have to have a sense of self-preservation to a degree. And so, there have been times when I have like literally given more than I can afford, and it's ended up hurting me in the end. And then I also think that there are a lot of people, especially in Seattle, who want to put the onus and the blame of homelessness on the people experiencing it without understanding what led to that. I always say that there are as many reasons and paths to homelessness as there are people experiencing it, because every story, as you know, is nuanced and different in ways. There might be some like trends and through lines and similarities, but there's a retired executive from one of Seattle's biggest tech companies that I won't name. He was recently arguing with me about homelessness and the causes and the solutions, and I told him, I was like, well, I've experienced, I was homeless as a teenager in Seattle. And he was like, well, that's different. And I'm like, no, it's really not. Because yeah, while I didn't end up like falling into addiction, mostly because I was too scared to even try drugs. Like that, I mean, that is a detail of like how my life turned out the way that it did. Like, my sister, for example, has struggled with addiction, but we come from the same family. There are just a lot of people who want to put the blame of homelessness on individual people. Like, oh, well, you're homeless because you're not trying hard enough. Yeah, you're homeless choices. Because of your bad choices. And without like considering things like racism, classism, colorism,
all the isms.
Yeah, and just the extreme disparity, this extreme economic disparity that we have, especially in Seattle. Yeah, I think a lot of people don't want to acknowledge the privilege that has allowed them to have a really comfortable life and opportunities. And I want everyone to have that comfortable life.
I love how Sabra ended our talk by sharing, I want everyone to have that comfortable life. We live in a capitalistic society where people are allowed, encouraged, and even revered for amassing great wealth and power. At a minimum, we should all be afforded the opportunity to have our basic needs met and to live that comfortable life. I want to give a heartfelt thank you to Sabra for sharing her personal journey so openly with us and for the work she has dedicated herself to shining a light on the exploitation of vulnerability in our society. Please consider supporting real change, whether that is making a donation or regularly purchasing a paper from their street vendors. You Know Me Now is a project under the nonprofit Facing Homelessness. It is produced, written, and edited by Tomas Bernatsky and me, Rex Holbein. Please join the 50,000-plus followers on our very active Facing Homelessness Facebook page, where you can join in on the conversation. Thank you for listening to this episode of You Know Me Now.